In the winter of 1258, the mightiest army the world had ever seen marched toward the jewel of Islam. 138,000 Mongol warriors descended upon Baghdad, the city of 1,001 nights, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the heart of human knowledge. They came with siege engines and fire, with arrows that darkened the sky, with the hunger for conquest that had already swallowed half the known world. Behind the ancient walls, 1 million souls prayed for salvation. But salvation was not coming. And then the gates fell. Flames erupted from the great libraries. Screams echoed through marble halls where scholars once debated the stars. The Tigris River, that ancient artery of Mesopotamian civilization, began to change color. First red, blood pouring from the streets, from the mosques, from the palaces, washing into the current like a crimson tide. Then black, ink bleeding from 1 million manuscripts, from 5 centuries of accumulated wisdom, from the dreams of philosophers and the equations of mathematicians, all dissolving into the murky waters. For 7 days, the river carried the death of an entire civilization toward the sea, and when the carnage finally ended, the last caliph of Baghdad knelt before his conqueror, only to be rolled into a carpet and crushed beneath the hooves of Mongol horses. The Islamic Golden Age did not fade. It was drowned in blood and ink, and the echo of that destruction would reshape the destiny of human civilization forever. To understand what was lost in those 7 days of horror, one must first understand what Baghdad had become in the 5 centuries before the Mongols arrived. Founded in 762 by Caliph al-Mansur, the city was designed from its inception to be the center of the world. Its original name, Madinat al-Salam, meant the city of peace, and for generations it lived up to that promise. Situated at the crossroads of ancient trade routes where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers drew closest together, Baghdad became the meeting point of East and West, of Greek philosophy and Persian poetry, of Indian mathematics and Chinese papermaking, of Arab astronomy and Jewish medicine. By the 9th century, Baghdad had grown into the largest city on earth. Its population approached 1 million souls, a number that would not be matched by any European city for another 700 years. The streets teemed with merchants from every corner of the known world. Caravans arrived daily from China, bearing silk and spices. Ships sailed up the Tigris, carrying goods from India, Africa, and the distant islands of Southeast Asia. Gold flowed through the markets like water, and with that gold came something far more precious: knowledge. The House of Wisdom, Bait al-Hikmah, stood at the heart of this intellectual revolution. Founded by Caliph Harun al-Rashid and expanded dramatically by his son al-Mamun, this institution became the greatest library and research center the world had ever known. Its mission was simple yet revolutionary: to gather all human knowledge under one roof and translate it into Arabic so that scholars everywhere could access the accumulated wisdom of civilization. Greek texts that had been lost to Europe for centuries were preserved here. The works of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, and Galen were not merely copied but studied, critiqued, and expanded upon. Persian astronomical tables were refined with new observations. Indian numerals, including the concept of zero, were introduced to the wider world through Arabic translations that would eventually transform European mathematics. The scholars of Baghdad did not simply preserve ancient knowledge, they advanced it. Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra, giving the world both the word and the discipline that would become the foundation of modern mathematics. His name itself would be corrupted into the term algorithm. Al-Kindi pioneered the systematic study of philosophy in the Islamic world, attempting to reconcile Greek thought with Islamic theology. Ibn al-Haytham revolutionized the study of optics, conducting experiments that laid the groundwork for the scientific method centuries before Francis Bacon. Physicians in Baghdad performed surgeries that would not be attempted in Europe for another 500 years. Astronomers charted the movements of stars with a precision that navigators would rely upon for generations. The House of Wisdom was not merely a library. It was an astronomical observatory, a translation bureau, a research academy, and a gathering place for the greatest minds of the age. Scholars of all faiths were welcome. Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians and Muslims worked side by side, united by a shared love of learning. The caliphs paid translators in gold, equal to the weight of the books they produced, an incentive that attracted intellectual talent from across the known world. At its peak, the House of Wisdom contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts representing the accumulated knowledge of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arab civilizations. It was, without exaggeration, the single greatest repository of human wisdom that had ever existed. But empires rise and fall. By the 13th century, the Abbasid Caliphate had long since lost its political power. Regional dynasties had carved up its territories. The caliphs retained their spiritual authority, their title as commanders of the faithful, but they ruled directly over little more than Baghdad itself and the surrounding regions of Iraq. The city remained wealthy, still a center of trade and learning, but its military strength had withered. The great armies that had once conquered from Spain to Central Asia were now mere memories. What remained was a court more concerned with ceremony than security, with poetry than preparedness. Into this declining world came a force unlike anything the Islamic civilization had ever faced. The Mongol Empire, forged by Genghis Khan in the steppes of Central Asia, had already conquered more territory in a single generation than Rome had accumulated in 5 centuries. From the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Eastern Europe, the descendants of Genghis Khan ruled an empire of unprecedented scale. Their armies moved with terrifying speed. Their tactics combined mobile cavalry warfare with sophisticated siege engineering, learned from Chinese experts, and their reputation for absolute destruction preceded them like a cold wind. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and brother to Kublai Khan, who would later rule China, was dispatched westward in 1251 with a single mission: to subjugate all lands from Persia to Egypt that had not yet submitted to Mongol authority. For this campaign, Mongke Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, authorized the largest army the Mongols had ever assembled. 1 in every 10 fighting men throughout the entire empire was conscripted for Hulagu's expedition. The force that eventually gathered numbered over 138,000 warriors, drawn from every corner of the Mongol domains. Chinese engineers accompanied the cavalry, bringing with them siege weapons and explosives unknown in the Middle East. Christian soldiers from Armenia and Georgia joined the host, eager to strike against their Muslim neighbors. It was not merely an army, it was an extinction event in human form. Hulagu's first target was the Nizari Ismaili state, the legendary assassins, whose mountain fortress of Alamut had defied all attackers for nearly 2 centuries. In 1256, after a brief siege, Alamut fell. The Grand Master of the Assassins was executed. The libraries of the fortress, containing centuries of Ismaili scholarship, were burned. It was a preview of what was to come. With the assassins destroyed, Hulagu turned his attention to the greatest prize of all: Baghdad. The correspondence between Hulagu and Caliph al-Mustasim has been preserved by historians, and it reads like a dialogue between thunder and silence. Hulagu's first message demanded that the Caliph submit peacefully, dismantle his fortifications, and send his 3 principal ministers to the Mongol camp as hostages. The letter was blunt, threatening, and left no room for negotiation. Al-Mustasim's response was astonishingly defiant for a ruler with so little military power. He called Hulagu young and ignorant. He boasted of his ability to summon armies from across the Islamic world. He warned that an attack on Baghdad would bring divine punishment upon the Mongols. It was bravado without substance. Al-Mustasim had inherited a caliphate already in terminal decline. He was known more for his love of poetry and pigeon racing than for administrative competence. His court was divided between factions that offered contradictory advice. His Grand Vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, a Shia Muslim who bore grudges against the Sunni establishment, may have deliberately sabotaged the caliphate's defenses, though the full extent of his treachery remains debated by historians. What is certain is that al-Mustasim did almost nothing to prepare for the coming storm. He did not summon additional troops. He did not strengthen the city's ancient walls. He did not stockpile supplies for a siege. He simply sat in his palace, surrounded by treasure he refused to spend on defense, and waited for a miracle that would never come. The Mongol army approached Baghdad from multiple directions in late 1257. Hulagu commanded the main force from the east. General Baiju led a northern wing that crossed the Tigris at Mosul. A third force under Kitbuka approached from the south through Khuzestan. The caliphate's territory was being encircled like prey in a tightening noose. When al-Mustasim finally sent 20,000 cavalry to confront the northern force, the Mongols employed a tactic of devastating simplicity. They broke the dikes along the Dujel Canal, flooding the land behind the Abbasid army after it had advanced. Trapped between the Mongol forces and rising waters, the caliphal cavalry was annihilated. The survivors who managed to escape drowned or were cut down as they fled. By mid-January of 1258, the Mongol forces had completely surrounded Baghdad. The siege began on January 29th. The defenders numbered perhaps 30,000 soldiers, a mixture of professional troops, urban militia, and volunteers who knew they were fighting for their lives. Against them stood the most formidable military machine on the planet. The Mongol siege engines were unlike anything the defenders had seen. Chinese engineers had constructed massive trebuchets capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds. Explosive projectiles, an early form of gunpowder weapon, crashed against the walls with terrifying effect. The constant bombardment shook the city day and night. Dust hung in the air. The sound of impact became the rhythm of despair. Within days, breaches began to appear in the ancient fortifications that had protected Baghdad for 5 centuries. On February 4th, Mongol troops captured the eastern wall. The defenders fell back, fighting street by street, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outmatched. Al-Mustasim, finally comprehending the magnitude of his failure, attempted to negotiate. He sent delegations offering tribute, offering submission, offering anything the Mongols wanted. Hulagu refused every overture. 3,000 leading citizens of Baghdad came out under a flag of truce to negotiate directly with the Mongol commander. Every one of them was executed. On February 10th, 1258, al-Mustasim surrendered the city. He emerged from the gates with his family, his ministers, and his remaining officials, hoping that submission would spare his people. It would not. Hulagu ordered a 3-day pause before his troops entered the city. The delay was deliberate, calculated to let fear ferment, to let the population understand that what was coming was inevitable. When the Mongol army finally poured through the gates on February 13th, they came not as conquerors seeking submission, but as executioners delivering judgment. What followed was one of the most thorough destructions of a major city in human history. The Mongols fanned out through the streets in organized squads, each assigned a sector, each with orders to kill and destroy. They moved systematically, building by building, street by street. Mosques were violated and burned. Palaces were looted and demolished. Hospitals where the sick lay helpless were put to the torch with their patients still inside. The screaming seemed to come from everywhere at once, a symphony of terror that echoed off the smoke-blackened walls. The massacre continued for 7 days. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of almost unimaginable horror. Mongol soldiers, reportedly tired of killing by hand, and devised new methods to increase their efficiency. Captives were bound and thrown into the Tigris. Families were locked inside buildings that were then set ablaze. Children were separated from their parents and slaughtered before their eyes. The only population spared was the Christian community, saved by the intervention of Hulagu's wife, Doku's Khatun, who was herself a Nestorian Christian. For everyone else, there was no mercy. The House of Wisdom died in those 7 days. Mongol soldiers carried armloads of manuscripts into the streets and hurled them into the Tigris. 5 centuries of accumulated human knowledge, hundreds of thousands of irreplaceable texts, works of philosophy and medicine and astronomy and mathematics that existed nowhere else on Earth were fed to the river like garbage. According to witnesses, the waters of the Tigris ran black with dissolved ink for days afterward. The quantity of books thrown into the river was so vast that some accounts claim they formed a bridge across the water sturdy enough to support a man on horseback. Whether literally true or not, the image captures the magnitude of intellectual devastation. The same river ran red with blood. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly, as precise counts were impossible amid such chaos. Hulagu himself later estimated the dead at around 200,000. Persian chroniclers placed the number at 800,000. Some accounts claim more than 1 million perished, either killed directly by the Mongols or dying afterward from starvation and disease as the city's infrastructure collapsed. The truth is unknowable. What can be said with certainty is that one of the world's greatest cities was depopulated in a single week. Baghdad, which had held nearly 1 million inhabitants, was reduced to a haunted ruin. The stench of decomposing bodies became so overwhelming that Hulagu was forced to move his camp upwind of the city. Throughout the slaughter, Al-Mustasim was kept alive. Hulagu had uses for him that required him to witness the destruction of everything he had failed to protect. The caliph was forced to watch as his city burned, as his treasury was emptied, as his subjects were massacred by the hundreds of thousands. According to one famous account, Hulagu brought the caliph to his treasure rooms, filled with gold that Al-Mustasim had hoarded rather than spending on defense, and mocked him with bitter irony. He placed a golden tray before the starving caliph and said, "Eat." When Al-Mustasim replied that gold was not edible, Hulagu asked why he had kept it rather than giving it to his soldiers to defend his city. "Such was God's will," the caliph is said to have responded. "What will befall thee," Hulagu replied, "is also God's will." On February 20th, 1258, Hulagu ordered the caliph's execution. The Mongols believed that spilling royal blood upon the earth would bring cosmic misfortune, that the very ground would cry out against such sacrilege. They had developed methods to execute nobles without technically shedding their blood. Al-Mustasim was rolled into a carpet, wrapped tight so he could not move, and laid upon the ground. Then the Mongol cavalry rode their horses over him. The last Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, the 37th spiritual leader of Sunni Islam in an unbroken line stretching back to the Prophet Muhammad's uncle, was crushed to death beneath hooves while wrapped in the finest fabrics of his own palace. Most of his family died with him. His sons were executed. His daughters were distributed as concubines among the Mongol commanders. A single son was reportedly sent to Mongolia as a prisoner, where he lived out his days in obscurity, fathering children who would play no role in Islamic history. The dynasty that had ruled the Islamic world for over 500 years ended not with a final battle, not with a dramatic last stand, but with the muffled sounds of a man being trampled inside a rug. The destruction of Baghdad sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world and beyond. For Muslims, it was an almost incomprehensible catastrophe. The city that had been the seat of the caliphate, the symbolic center of Islamic civilization, had been erased. The spiritual leader of Sunni Islam had been murdered in the most degrading manner imaginable. The greatest library in the world had been destroyed, its contents either burned or dissolved in river water. An entire tradition of learning, centuries of scientific and philosophical progress, had been interrupted in ways that would take generations to comprehend. The Islamic Golden Age, that remarkable period of intellectual flourishing that had preserved and advanced human knowledge while Europe slumbered in its dark ages, came to an abrupt and violent end. The institutions that had supported scholarship were destroyed. The patronage networks that had funded research disappeared. The libraries that had preserved ancient texts were ashes. Some knowledge was saved. The Persian astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi managed to transfer approximately 400,000 manuscripts to Massacre before the siege, where they became the foundation of a new observatory under Mongol patronage, but much more was lost forever. Historians have debated for centuries whether the sack of Baghdad truly ended Islamic intellectual life, or whether the decline had other causes. What cannot be debated is the immediate devastation. Baghdad itself did not recover its previous population until the 20th century, nearly 700 years later. It never again served as a center of learning comparable to what it had been. The geographical and cultural center of the Islamic world shifted permanently, eventually relocating to Cairo under the Mamluks and later to Istanbul under the Ottomans. But something had been broken that could never be fully repaired. For the Mongols, the destruction of Baghdad was simply another conquest, another city added to their vast empire. Hulagu continued his westward march. Conquering Syria and threatening Egypt before his advance was finally halted at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, where Mamluk forces inflicted the first significant defeat on a Mongol army. But the damage was done. The heart of Islamic civilization had been cut out, and no military victory could restore what had been lost. In the centuries that followed, some historians have argued that the destruction of Baghdad inadvertently contributed to the rise of Western civilization. By eliminating the Islamic world's intellectual leadership, the Mongols created a vacuum that would eventually be filled by European thinkers rediscovering the very texts that Islamic scholars had preserved. The irony is bitter. Knowledge that survived in Baghdad for centuries, translated and expanded by Muslim scholars, would only reach Europe after the library that housed it was destroyed. What might have been if Baghdad had survived, if the House of Wisdom had continued its work, remains one of history's great unanswerable questions. Today, the Tigris still flows through Baghdad. Its waters no longer black with ink or red with blood. The city has been rebuilt, destroyed, rebuilt again. The House of Wisdom exists only in memory and in the fragments of knowledge that survived its destruction. But the echo of those 7 days in February 1258 still resonates through history. It reminds us how fragile civilization can be, how quickly centuries of progress can be undone, how easily the accumulated wisdom of generations can dissolve into murky water. When the Mongol horses finally rode away from Baghdad, they left behind a silence that had not existed there for 500 years. The great markets were empty, the libraries were ash, the mosques were ruins. The canals that had made the desert bloom were choked with bodies, and the river, that ancient witness to Mesopotamian civilization since before recorded history, carried the remnants of an empire toward the sea. Some legacies are measured in what they built. The legacy of Baghdad is measured in what was lost, in the manuscripts that no longer exist, in the discoveries that were never made, in the questions that will never be answered because the people who might have answered them were crushed beneath horses or drowned in a river running black with the ink of their own civilization. The Islamic Golden Age ended not with a whisper, but with a scream. And when the screaming finally stopped, the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before. The center of human knowledge had shifted. The balance of civilizations had changed, and somewhere beneath the waters of the Tigris, dissolved beyond recovery, lay the dreams of scholars who had believed that knowledge was immortal. It was not. Nothing is. That is the lesson Baghdad taught the world in the winter of 1258. And it is a lesson that humanity has been forced to relearn again and again in every age since.